started as a normal day, just like any other. I took a shower and grabbed a quick cup of coffee before heading out of the front door and waving goodbye to my loving wife. I jumped on board the bus, sat down, turned on my MP3 player, and promptly entered my usual daydream state. I finally arrived at my office building, headed up the 10th floor, and sat down at my desk to see a huge pile of paperwork. I sighed and got started. A scream coming from down the hall broke my concentration. I considered going to see what it was, but the thought quickly passed. Probably just another hysterical secretary overreacting to a spider. Just as I started getting back to work, something else grabbed my attention. I peered out the window into the street below, and to my astonishment, saw a scene of utter chaos. People fighting, even killing each other for seemingly no reason. By this time, some of my coworkers had gotten up from their desks and joined me in staring out the window. The radio began blurting out all kinds of information. It said that a new breed of virus had been discovered, one that would change its victims into a homicidal maniac. This virus was highly contagious and spreading rapidly. Their advice was to stay where I was, and that if I were to encounter an infected person, I should try to destroy their brain. At this point, I felt myself entering a state of mild shock. It was obvious that whatever was going on was serious, and that a significant percentage of the population were going to be killed or wounded over the course of the next few days. My thoughts quickly turned to my wife. Was she okay? What if these maniacs were near our home? I knew that the phone lines would most likely be overwhelmed, so I decided not to waste time by calling. I headed straight home. I began to make my way through a series of corridors that lead to the elevator. On my way, I noticed a struggle out of the corner of my eye. I turned to see a disfigured man frantically clawing at and biting a young woman's leg. Blood was already pouring from her multiple wounds. The woman cried out for me to help her. I began to look for somebody to help, but all of my fellow coworkers seemed to be far more interested in saving their own skins. By the time I returned to the office, both the crazed man and the wounded woman had gone. I decided to continue to the elevator. I arrived at the elevator, but to my dismay it seemed many other people had the same idea. I heard a ping and the elevator doors slid open. In a split second, the large crowd of office staff pushed and shoved their way into the tiny metal box. I quickly made my way down the stairs to the ground floor. Sure, I was a little out of breath, but at least I saved time and avoided a potentially lethal situation. I eventually reached the ground floor and entered the lobby. The scene in front of me was one of extreme violence. The security team was desperately battling with a swarm of infected, and they appeared to be losing. I watched helplessly as a guard on the opposite side of the room was torn limb from limb. I noticed his gun lying on the floor just a few meters away from his dismembered corpse. I managed to slip away without any infected noticing and proceeded quickly towards the rear exit. I made my way through several corridors towards the back of the building. As I approached the rear entrance, I spotted a hefty padlock across the bolt, making it practically impossible to open without a key. I cursed my bad luck and tried to figure out my next move. The janitor would have had the key, but reaching his office would have required going back towards the lobby. I realized that breaking the door down would be impossible, and that heading back would be too dangerous, so I set about searching for another exit. I remembered that there was a small window in the male bathroom just a few doors down the corridor. I arrived at the bathroom door and pushed it open. Suddenly, I heard a bestial roar coming from further down the corridor. A dozen infected had spotted me and were now heading in my direction. I quickly entered the stall and spotted the window I was thinking of. However, to my dismay, it was much smaller than I had remembered. I thought that I would probably fit, but I knew it was going to be a very tricky maneuver. Not wanting to waste time, I set about trying to squeeze through the window. A few awkward movements and a lot of pain later, I managed to force my way into the street, escaping the infected with only a few seconds to spare. I dropped from the window and landed on the pavement with a heavy thud. Looking up and down the quiet back street, I tried to decide what to do next. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that my best bet was to head to a main road and try to steal a vehicle or catch a lift. I jogged down the quiet street for a few hundred feet before stopping to catch my breath. I looked up briefly and saw a little girl wandering aimlessly in the middle of the road. I called out to the little girl. She slowly turned towards me before looking up, letting out a ghastly scream and charging towards me. My instincts told me that she was infected, and I immediately began to run in the opposite direction. Luckily, her legs simply weren't long enough to keep pace with me. Within a couple of minutes, she had lost my scent. I eventually arrived at the main road. As I suspected, the scene wasn't pretty. In every direction, I could see people either trying to fight or flee from the numerous infected. An array of dismembered corpses already littered the streets. I suddenly felt nauseous, and within a few moments I was vomiting my breakfast all over the pavement. I wiped my mouth with my sleeve and looked up to see a bus driving down the street. The number was the same as the one I usually took home. There appeared to be a lot of people on board already, but I thought I might be able to squeeze in. I realized that getting on the crowded bus probably wasn't a good idea. If someone on board were infected, then there would have been no escape. As I continued down the street, I noticed several groups of people. Just across the road was a group of men with rifles. They appeared to be having fun shooting the zombies rather than trying to escape. In the alley, I could just about see a group of teenage boys armed with a variety of makeshift melee weapons. A few meters from where I was standing, a paramedic and an armed police officer were helping a wounded man, and as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw a group of survivors from my office building, heading in the same direction. I decided that it was probably best to team up with other survivors. I jogged over to the group of my fellow co-workers. They seemed happy to see me. I told the group that I thought we should try to find some transportation to get out of the city center. One of them suggested we go to the parking area a few blocks down. We quickly agreed to our strategy and made our way down the street. As we approached the car parking area, we noticed a few infected wandering idly around the entrance. There was no real way to avoid them. I began making as much noise as I could, running in circles around the infected. My plan worked, and they began to follow me away from the entrance. The others swiftly entered the parking area and began searching for a suitable vehicle. I was glad they had made it inside, but I was still in serious danger. I eventually managed to lose the infected and quickly caught up with the others. But I promised myself I'd never volunteer to be bait again. We eventually found a few different options for vehicles in which we could make our escape. On the far side of the parking area, we found a pair of road motorbikes. Closer to us was a four-wheel drive all-terrain Jeep, a large freight truck, and a convertible sports car. suggested that we take the Jeep, and the others quickly agreed. Having the ability to go off-road if necessary would be incredibly useful, especially since many roads would have been blocked with traffic, accidents, or zombies. We approached the Jeep and peered inside. To our dismay, we saw a pair of infected inside, desperately clawing at the windows in an attempt to escape. I made my suggestion, but the others didn't listen. They really wanted that Jeep, and a few zombies weren't going to stand in their way. The others immediately flung open the doors and started trying to drag the zombies out. However, without my help, they were having serious trouble, and it seemed like they would most likely end up dead if I didn't intervene. I headed towards the motorbike and didn't look back. I climbed aboard my chosen vehicle and sped away from the car park onto the main street. By then the roads were littered with bodies and car wreckages. It was all I could do to avoid them. Everywhere I looked, I could see only scenes of carnage. It seemed that those not already infected were fighting a losing battle. My thoughts quickly turned to my wife. I tried to tell myself that she would be okay, but that didn't stop the horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. I knew I had to get home as soon as possible. In the distance, I could see a gas station with a few of the zombies on the forecourt. I quickly glanced down at the fuel gauge and saw that I only had about half a tank remaining. I decided not to stop for gas or supplies due to the potential danger. Half a gas tank was more than enough to get home anyway. I continued down the road before turning onto the main highway out of town. However, it wasn't long before I noticed a mass of vehicles blocking the road ahead. The combined sound of all the honking, shouting, and screaming was deafening. Nobody had kept to their lanes, and cars were packed so closely together that not even a bicycle could squeeze through. The blockage extended so far down the road that it was literally impossible to discern what the cause was. I decided that there was no point in waiting for the traffic to clear, and that without the Jeep, driving off the road was just too dangerous. I headed back the way I came and turned off the highway at the first exit. I soon found a safer, albeit less direct route home. As I sped down the disturbingly quiet back road, my mind began to wander. Without the distraction of imminent danger, I began to remember the horrific scenes I had witnessed just an hour ago. Images of mangled corpses flashed before my eyes, and my head began to spin. I swerved onto the wrong side of the road, just as another vehicle pulled out from a concealed entrance. I braked sharply, but it was too late to avoid a collision. Amazingly, I wasn't seriously injured, but my ride was badly damaged. I realized that without transport, I would have to walk the rest of the way home. Not wanting to waste any more precious time, I continued my journey on foot. After a half an hour of walking, I began to recognize my surroundings, and knew that I would soon be home. There were several different routes I could take. I decided to get off the main road, as it would undoubtedly be dangerous in such a heavily populated area. I decided to follow the train line instead, since it ran not far from my house and would be totally deserted. Sure enough, I didn't see another soul. I finally arrived in my neighborhood, exhausted. I knew that my house was just a little further down the street, but the area was swarming with the infected. Most of them seemed distracted by what few survivors remained, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they noticed me. I remembered about a small alleyway nearby, one that would take me most of the way home in relative safety. I entered the alley, and as expected, it seemed totally devoid of life. However, as I walked past a large dumpster, an infected old man stepped out of the shadows and tried to grab me. I grabbed him by the neck, realizing that he'd be unable to bite me. I pushed him away as hard as I could, and he stumbled backward. I had bought myself valuable time, but it wouldn't take long for the creature to regain its balance and come at me again. I turned to run back the way I had came, only to see that another group of them had followed and were now blocking my retreat. My only hope was to try and get past the lone infected. Grabbing a brick, I waited just long enough for the infected to get close before smashing it into his face. There was a sickening crack as his jawbone fractured and blood sprayed from his mouth. My former neighbor fell to the ground, and before he could get back up, I was able to run past. I sped down the alley and back onto the street. When I looked over my shoulder, there was no sign of my pursuers. I could see my house now, just 100 feet or so away. My heart sank when I saw yet another group of infected wandering aimlessly between me and my goal. Too dangerous to carry on down the street. I went around the back of one of the neighbors' houses and climbed over the fence into their garden. It was tiring, but I carried on scrambling over the fences until I got to my own backyard. As I approached the house, I noticed the glass in the back door had been smashed and the door left slightly ajar. I was terrified for my wife's safety. Whoever had broken into the house could still be in there, and without a weapon, I wouldn't be able to help my wife. I headed over to the shed and checked my pockets. Luckily, I still had my keys and was able to remove the padlock and open the door. Inside, there was a wide range of tools to choose from. I took the crowbar, knowing that it would be easy to swing indoors, yet still heavy enough to cave in a human skull. With my weapon in hand, I left the shed and walked back to my house. Before I could enter, I discovered why the back door had been left ajar. A teenage looter emerged from the house carrying my television, obviously intent on profiting from the crisis. When he saw me, he dropped the TV and pulled out a large kitchen knife. At that moment, I couldn't tell which one of us was more afraid. I told the looter that I wasn't going to hurt him, and that he could take the TV and go. He didn't bother to pick it back up. Instead, he ran over to the nearby fence and climbed over into the neighbor's garden. Having dealt with the looter, I walked in through the back door. I was relieved to finally be safely indoors, but I couldn't rest yet. Not until I was certain my wife was okay. I quickly shut the back door and locked it, then looked around for some furniture to wedge in front of it. It took me a few minutes to properly secure the entrance, but at least I knew nobody would be able to force their way in. I began searching the ground floor for my wife. As I came into the living room, I saw that John from next door was standing there. He had his back to me and was clearly oblivious to my presence. His shirt was covered in red stains. I decided it was best not to disturb him and carefully backed away. If he had noticed me, he certainly didn't show it. As I went to go upstairs, I noticed a note had been left for me by the front door. I recognized my wife's handwriting immediately. The note said that she couldn't wait for me any longer and that she was going to pack her bags and take the car to her parents' house in the countryside. As I read the note, my heart sank. I prayed that she would be able to make it to her parents in one piece, but knowing how hard it had been for me to get here, I couldn't help but wonder if she was still alive. When I realized I may never see her again, I began to feel tears rolling down my cheek. pulled myself together and resolved to keep searching. I needed to make sure the house was secure before planning my next move. As I climbed the stairs, I heard an odd shuffling noise coming from my bedroom. I didn't know if it was my wife, a looter, or another of the infected. I walked over to the door slowly and gently knocked as I called out to whoever was inside. My reply was a scream and a call for help. It was my wife's voice. I swung open the door and went inside. The scene that greeted me will haunt my nightmares for years to come. My beautiful wife was pinned on the floor, desperately trying to fight off one of the infected. She could barely keep the creature at bay, and if I didn't act immediately, she would surely die. I ran at the infected and kicked it in the face with all my might. It was enough to get the beast away from my wife, and I was able to quickly finish the job without the risk of hitting her by mistake. I was finally reunited with my wife. I dropped the weapon and held her as tightly as I could. In that moment, I was happier than I had ever been, yet the feeling would not last long. I asked her if she was okay, and she showed me her hand. Blood dripped from several bite marks on her fingers. I didn't know if she would become infected or not, or even how much longer she had. She sobbed as I struggled to decide what to do. I had to do something and do it quickly. If I could stop the spread of the infection, I might just be able to save her life. We ran down to the kitchen, took a clean meat cleaver from the knife rack, and tied an improvised tourniquet around her wrist. Within seconds it was over, and I was carefully dressing the wounds with bandages from our first aid kit. I didn't know if she would survive or not, but at least now we had hope. My wife and I spent some time discussing what to do next. We realized that we couldn't stay in the house forever, as it was just too dangerous this close to civilization. We decided that our best bet was to load up the car with food and supplies, and then head for her parents' house out in the country. I made sure the house was secure, dragged the corpses down to the basement, and then helped my wife get everything ready. She looked pale and weak, but it didn't seem like she would turn, at least not for a while yet. By the time everything was ready, it was already nightfall, so we decided to spend one more night at home before hitting the road. I don't think either of us slept that night, but it was better than traveling in the dark. We left at dawn. Crowded with coworkers, and I could barely see or hear anything with all the commotion. I only managed to pick out the phrases psychovirus and destroy the brain. I tried to get back to my work, but a few minutes later, I overheard one of my coworkers talking about a virus that makes people homicidal. However, I could only make out bits and pieces of the conversation, and didn't learn anything especially useful. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down. A few minutes later, I overheard one of my coworkers talking about a virus that makes people homicidal. However, I could only make out bits and pieces of the conversation, and didn't learn anything especially useful. I dialed the number, but immediately got an error tone. I tried several more times before giving up. I was annoyed with myself for wasting time. I should have known the phones would be overwhelmed. I then decided that I would go home and make sure that my wife was okay. I hung around the office for a while, but it wasn't long before I began to hear shouts and screams echoing around the building. It seemed that the infection had already made its way inside, and that staying here was no longer safe. I eventually decided to go home and check on my wife. Had I left sooner, things would have been much less dangerous. I managed to pull the man away and push him into the corner of the room. However, as I turned to check on the lady, I noticed that her face had turned pale and had lost any expression. Before I had a chance to react, the former secretary lurched forward and ripped a chunk of flesh from my shoulder. It wasn't long before I became one of them. I dialed the number and immediately got a busy signal. I tried again several more times before giving up. By the time I was done, the woman already appeared to be dead, and the crazed man had turned his attention to me. I had no choice but to flee towards the elevator. I continued down the hallway, ignoring the woman's cries for help. She would have been infected, and it wasn't worth the risk. I just about managed to fit inside the elevator. The doors closed and it began to move downwards. However, it wasn't long before all hell broke loose. Somebody in the elevator had been hiding a bite wound, and within a few moments he was attacking the people around him. There was no escape. By the time I reached the ground floor, I was already covered in bites and scratches. It wouldn't be long before I became one of them. Myself out of the window in the hope of reaching the ground floor more quickly. However, it seemed I forgot one important fact. I worked on the 10th floor. My body hit the ground with a mighty splat. I waited for a few minutes, but just as before, a huge group of people amassed in front of the elevator. Knowing that entering it with such a large number of people could be dangerous, I eventually decided to take the stairs. I was annoyed at myself for wasting time. I managed to dodge several zombies, but just as soon as I got close to the gun, I slipped on a pool of blood. I stumbled directly into the group of infected. I frantically tried to escape their grip, but it was hopeless. I darted across the lobby, skillfully avoiding the zombies in my path. It wasn't until I burst through the main doors into the street that I realized my mistake. The situation there was even worse. The road was literally teeming with zombies. I attempted to make an escape, but it was no use. Within moments, I was overwhelmed. Retracing my steps back towards the lobby. After a minute or so, I was very close to the janitor's office. I rounded the final corner, but was forced to stop dead in my tracks. A group of around a dozen infected was blocking the corridor ahead. One of them saw me and let out a bestial groan, alerting the entire group to my presence. Without hesitation, I turned tail and fled towards the door. With the infected hot on my heels, I frantically began searching for another exit, but my efforts were in vain. Within a few seconds, I was cornered. I took a few steps back and several deep breaths before charging shoulder first towards the door. The impact knocked me to the floor, sending an intense pain through my right shoulder. Dazed, I stumbled to my feet and saw that the door was completely unaffected. I cursed my stupidity and set about finding another exit. I locked myself in a cubicle, sat on top of the toilet seat, and tried not to make any sound. Within a few moments, the zombies had shoved their way into the room. At first, it seemed like my plan was working. They spent a few moments stumbling around, not able to find me. However, I didn't know the infected had such a keen sense of smell. It wasn't long before they realized where I was. It took them a few good minutes to break through the door. Just enough time for me to make my peace with God. I grabbed a bundle of paper towels and began blocking the sinks. I turned on the taps and watched as water spilled all over the floor, creating a slick surface. Hearing the zombies approach, I immediately ran towards the window and began trying to squeeze through. The infected burst into the room and began to slip. However, this only seemed to buy me a few seconds, much less time than it took for me to actually flood the room. As I frantically tried to push through the window, one of them grabbed me and sunk his teeth into my leg. I managed to get free and escape into the street, but it was already too late. I was infected. I walked up to the girl and tapped her on the shoulder to get her attention. She suddenly spun around, let out a ghastly scream, and vomited blood into my face. Some of it got into my eye. It wasn't long before I contracted the virus and became one of them. I realized that the girl was most likely infected, and therefore I decided to ignore her and continue down the street. To my surprise, the bus screeched to a halt before opening its doors. I quickly jumped on board and squeezed through the crowd. I managed to grab a handle and steady myself as the bus started moving. I idly started looking at other people in the bus when I noticed blood dripping from an old man's arm. His eyes were glazed over and his skin was very pale. Before I had a chance to warn anyone, the man began to viciously attack everyone around him. The crowded bus quickly became a bloodbath, one that I couldn't escape from. I ran into the middle of the road and began signaling the bus to stop. However, the driver apparently suspected me of being infected and actually began to speed up. I barely managed to dive out of the way as the bus hurtled down the street. I walked over to the men with rifles. While I enjoyed the relative safety the guns provided, they seemed to be attracting a lot of attention from the infected. As time went on, more and more of them advanced on our position. Eventually, the men began to run out of ammunition, and the infected quickly surrounded us. There was no escape. I walked over to the group with the wounded man and began to help. I made my way to the teenage boys and began following them down the street. Clutching whatever makeshift weapons we had, and tried to engage them. At first things seemed to be going well. We knocked one of them to the ground and someone managed to smash his head with a rock. However, it wasn't long before we got careless, and one of us was bitten. Eventually the noise from all the commotion had attracted yet more inflicted, and we soon found ourselves hopelessly outnumbered, with little hope of escape. Swiftly towards the parking area, ducking and weaving between the zombies. Unfortunately, one of us stumbled and fell to the ground with a definite thud. By the time the rest of us noticed, it was already too late. The zombies had him pinned and were now tearing away at his flesh. Without saying a word to one another, we continued on our way and left him to his fate. After some heated discussion, somebody from the group eventually stepped up. He began making such a noise as he could, running in circles around the infected. My plan worked and they began to follow him away from the entrance. The rest of us swiftly made our way inside and began to search for a suitable vehicle. We were so wrapped in what we were doing that we forgot about our brave volunteer. We never saw him again. I suggested that we take the motorbikes. The others didn't seem to like the idea, stating that maneuvering bikes between the infected could be tricky, with 2 or 3 riders wedged on each one. The rest of the group decided that we would take the Jeep. I suggested taking the freight truck. The others quickly rejected my idea, stating that the truck would be too slow and wouldn't have enough maneuverability. The rest of the group decided that we would take the Jeep. I suggested taking the sports car. The others quickly rejected my idea, stating that the low ground clearance would make it impossible to take off-road in the event of a road blockage. The rest of the group decided that we would take the Jeep. We opened the doors, reached inside the Jeep, and tried to pull the infected from the vehicle. As I dragged the rotting body onto the tarmac, I felt a sharp pain. I looked down, and to my horror, saw blood pouring from several bite marks on my left forearm. I momentarily exchanged glances with the others before running as far away from them as I could. It wouldn't be long before I became a zombie. I stepped forward, reached inside the Jeep, and tried to help pull one of the infected from the vehicle. As I dragged the rotting body onto the tarmac, I felt a sharp pain. I looked down, and to my horror, saw blood pouring from several bite marks in my left forearm. I momentarily exchanged glances with the others, before running as far away from them as I could. It wouldn't be long before I became a zombie. I headed towards the sports car and didn't look back. I headed towards the freight truck and didn't look back. I pulled up to the forecourt and swiftly made my way to the convenience store. Since it appeared to be completely empty, I set about taking as much food as I could possibly carry. After a few short minutes, I was happy with what I'd acquired, and I started to make my way towards the exit. I pulled open the door to see 2 zombies from the forecourt directly in front of me. As I backed away, I stumbled and fell onto the ground. Before I knew it, a pair of infected men were on top of me, ripping into my flesh with their talon-like fingernails. I pulled up onto the forecourt, got out of the vehicle, and began to pull up the gas tank at the pump. However, within a few short moments, the infected began to notice me and started heading in my direction. As they started to get close, I decided that it would be best to escape while I still could. As I pulled away, I glanced down at the fuel gauge. It had barely gone up at all. I waited for the traffic jam to clear, but it wasn't long before I realized my mistake. Other vehicles began to pile up behind me, and soon I was totally surrounded. I decided to continue on foot, scrambling over other cars and dodging between what few gaps in the traffic remained. But it wasn't long before something went horribly wrong. The infected were spotted in the distance, and in the ensuing panic I was run over by a reversing SUV. I heard a sickening crack as the wheels rolled over my legs, and I knew that I would soon be dead. Sure enough, the infected soon found me and tore my body to shreds. decided to get off the road. And drive through the open fields instead. At first I made good progress, and as my thoughts turned to my wife, I started driving faster and faster, determined to get home to her as quickly as possible. By the time I saw the old tree stump among the crops, it was already too late. When I awoke hours later, I realized how lucky I was to still be alive. My ride was totaled, and I wasn't much better. Several of my bones were broken, and I could barely move, let alone walk. It wasn't long before one of the infected found me, and unable to defend myself, I was slowly eaten alive. As I walked over to the car, I realized that the driver was either unconscious or dead. I didn't care which. I opened his door, removed his seatbelt, and dragged him out of the driver's seat, not noticing the deep bite marks on his arms and neck. Before I realized he was infected, he regained consciousness and sunk his teeth into my wrist. I managed to escape and run off into the wood, but I succumbed to infection soon after. I spent the next 20 minutes trying to fix my vehicle, but it soon became apparent that without any tools or spare parts, I wouldn't be able to make any real progress. I cursed myself for wasting valuable time and continued on foot. I walked over to the car and I opened the driver's door. He was unconscious but didn't seem to be badly wounded. As I wondered what to do next, I noticed 3 large bite marks on his upper arm and realized that it wouldn't be long before he became one of the infected. I decided to leave him and continue on foot. I decided to carry on along the main road. As I got deeper into suburbia, more and more of the infected appeared, and it wasn't long before large groups of them started to come towards me from all directions. I tried to run, but no matter how many of them passed, more found me. Unable to run any further, I collapsed, utterly exhausted. I never got back up. I headed into the cornfields, thinking that the infected wouldn't be able to see me amongst the tall crops. I failed to take into account that I wouldn't be able to see them either. It didn't take long for a small group of them to sniff me out, and before I realized it, I was already surrounded. There was no hope of escape. I decided to get off the road and take a shortcut. I headed into the woods, realizing that the mindless infected would have a hard time navigating the undergrowth, and that there would be very few of them in the area anyway. I punched him as hard as I possibly could, but it didn't seem to have any effect. Before I could swing again, he grabbed me and sunk his teeth deep into my neck. I grabbed his arm and tried to throw him, but my footing was wrong, and I was barely able to lift him more than a few inches off the ground. As I held him, he took a huge bite out of my shoulder. I continued to struggle with my attacker, but within minutes I too was one of the infected. I grabbed his shoulder and pushed him backward, narrowly escaping being bitten. I grabbed a brick and threw it at my assailant as hard as I could. It hit him in the shoulder, which barely seemed to affect him at all. Before I could try anything else, he grabbed a hold of me and pulled me to the ground. I struggled to get free, but by then the others had caught up, and I was overwhelmed. I scrambled to my feet and ran at him as fast as I could, narrowly escaping the infected's grasp and pushing him to one side. I had escaped, but more by luck than judgment. I decided I would try to sneak past the infected, using the low garden walls, shrubs, and dust bins to hide my presence from the infected. Slowly but surely, I made my way up the street. None of them seemed to notice me until the wind changed, taking my scent straight to them. The group seemed to howl in unison before charging straight towards me. I tried to run, but soon found myself cornered. I was devoured just a few yards from my own front door. I decided that my best bet was to run past the infected. After all, I would soon be safely behind my front door. I took my keys from my pocket to save time before sprinting as fast as my legs would carry me through the group. I got past them with relative ease and sped up my garden path to the front door. Panicking, I struggled to get the key into the door, knowing the infected were closing in with every second. I finally got the key in the lock and tried to push the door open, but to my horror, it only moved an inch. My wife had put a chain on and wedged a bookcase in front of the door. I tried to force through, but my pursuers had already caught up with me. I was torn to pieces on my doorstep. Images of my wife being devoured flashed before my eyes. Without thinking, I ran straight into the house to help her, only to bump straight into the knife-wielding looter who had broken in to steal my possessions. He attacked me, and without a weapon to defend myself, I was quickly stabbed to death in my own home. I picked up the chainsaw, made sure it had a full tank of gas, and started up the motor. Only then did I remember how loud it was, but I didn't care. For the first time since the outbreak began, I felt powerful and in control. I left the shed and started to head over to the house. Suddenly, I realized that the group of infected from the street had heard the roar of the engine and were making their way into my backyard. Grinning evilly, I drove the spinning teeth deep into the first infected's chest, spraying blood and gore in all directions. A few drops went into my eye, and I already knew it was game over. It wasn't long before I was one of them. I decided to take the sledgehammer. It was heavy and hard to use, but could easily smash a man's skull in a single blow. Up the hand axe since it was light and easy to use, although perhaps not the most powerful of weapons. I wasted no time in unleashing a brutal assault against the scumbag. He tried to defend himself, swiping at me with the knife, but only managed to scratch my arm. In return, I rained down blow after blow upon him, and within minutes he was dead. A pool of blood oozed from what was left of his skull, staining my lawn in a sickly shade of red. I quickly shut the back door and turned the key. With the glass broken, it wouldn't keep out the infected long, but at least it would buy me some time. I had wasted enough time already, and wasn't about to waste any more. I immediately started looking for my wife. I walked over to John and asked him if he was okay. He turned slowly, revealing pure white eyes and a blood-stained jaw. Before I could react, he was upon me, savagely tearing out my throat with his bare hands and teeth. John was surely infected, so I snuck up behind him and hit him as hard as I could on the back of the head. His skull made a satisfying crack and he fell to the floor, dead. I had never liked him much anyway. As I went to go upstairs, I kicked the door open and charged in with my weapon raised, ready to kill whatever was on the other side. Like a pathetic coward, I fled, leaving my beloved wife to die. I ran downstairs, pushed the makeshift barricades from the front door, and ran out into the street. In my panic, I had forgotten about the large group of infected wandering just outside and ran straight into them. Within minutes, they had torn me to shreds. I deserved no better. Wasting no time at all, I smashed the infected over the head with my weapon. I was lucky not to hit my wife by mistake, but at least she was alive. I knew that she might turn into one of those things, but I couldn't abandon the woman I love. I had vowed to stay with her, till death do us part, and meant it. I would be there at the end, one way or the other. I couldn't face seeing the woman I love turn into one of those things. I told her to head into the bathroom and wash the wound. I pretended to go and get the first aid kit from the kitchen. Instead, I opened the back door and ran outside. I couldn't let my wife become one of them. I hugged her tight and kissed her one last time before telling her to close her eyes. I think she knew what was coming as she whispered, "I love you," one last time. I picked up my weapon and replied, "I love you too." Heartbroken, I decided that there was no point in staying. Everything reminded me of my wife, and besides, there was nothing left for me here now. Suburbia was heavily populated, and it would only get more and more dangerous as time wore on. I took some supplies from the kitchen and stuffed them in a backpack before heading back out through the gardens and as far away from civilization as I could. I left my house for the last time, alone. I climbed over the garden fences and headed for the countryside. I knew I had to get away from populated areas as quickly as possible if I was to have any hope of survival. Yet without my wife by my side, I could barely see the point. I'm not sure how I managed to avoid the infected as I made my way out of town, but I soon found myself on an abandoned farm just a few miles away. As night fell, I decided to shelter in the old barn. It was cold, dark, and bitterly lonely. I sobbed for hours, wondering what I had done to deserve this living hell. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I took a short rope and climbed up into the loft.